everyone. Thank you so much for tuning in to our very first episode of Voices from East to West podcast, where we sit down, we unpack big ideas, and basically just try to make sense of how culture shapes us and how we shape culture right back. This whole series is about boosting cultural intelligence, understanding global leadership in a more human way, and exploring how society is constantly being molded by the traditions, the histories, and the creative expressions that surround us. And honestly, this is actually exactly what we do as a company. At East to West Consultancy, we work with individuals and groups also to help them navigate culture consciously. We coach, we train, we open up conversations. We teach all of this in a way that's like actually practical, relatable, and rooted in real life, not just textbooks. Now, our first episode, we wanted to start with something a little bit magical. The title of this episode is Art as a Mirror of Identity, because art isn't just decoration, it's basically a mirror of your identity. It shows you how the culture sees itself, how it communicates, how it remembers, and even how it dreams. The whole idea today is to explore how art shapes cultures and how cultures in return shape the art that they produce. My name is Jaz, and I'm here with my co host Emran, who is our culture code breaker in residence. He is Afghan, as you can see in his background. I mean, if you're listening to the podcast, then you can't see, but he does have an Afghan flag behind him. He is passionate about tradition, storytelling, art, and all the layers behind why people behave the way that they do. If you've ever read one of our East to West blog posts, yeah, that's him. And today also we have the amazing Shaima joining us. Thank you so much for taking the time today. She is a museum educator and art historian who has worked with some of the most incredible institutions across the Gulf and beyond. She brings a perspective rooted in heritage, creative learning, and the power of objects, how things we create end up shaping the way that we think and learn. So before we dive in, as I was kind of creating the name of this podcast, a really interesting question popped into my mind um, of like, is art really a reflection of the culture, or does the culture, or is the culture the reflection of the art that we actually inherit? So, like, what really comes first? Is it the expression or is it the identity? Shema, I'd like to invite you here to have any kind of input.
Yes, first of all, thank you for having me so much. It's great to be able to talk about stuff that I'm really passionate about, and it's nice to nerd out with fellow nerds. Um, so that's a really interesting question. It's a very chicken and egg question about which came by first. I am of the opinion that we probably started with expression because, the first instances of civilizations are people getting together, sitting near a fire, and telling stories and making up stories. That's where a lot of histories of religions and how we explain what goes on in the world comes about. And that kind of led on to leaving a mark for other people. So if you think as far back as cave paintings, it was, people engaging in this kind of storytelling and deciding, hey, this is some really fun stuff, and we want to be able to leave an imprint for those that come afterwards. And for me, I really like that idea that, art and creativity and storytelling has always served the purpose of bringing people together in the most rustic way, which is sitting down with some tasty food and telling stories to each other. And, it's that it's a very, I want to say South Asian and Arab thing, but it also goes beyond those cultures where you have this image of a grandparent sitting on a chair and all the little kids and cousins, nieces and nephews sitting at their feet and being told stories of the past. Like that is something that we have done across cultures, across nations, and that is really heritage and culture and tradition and where it starts. So I like to think that that's how we shape our worldview, that it comes from a point in history that's retold person to person, and that then becomes inculcated in how we live out our lives, that informs our behaviors, how we see the world. It's also a really wholesome way of looking at it.
Yeah, I was gonna say that sounds really, really sweet.
Shema, I like how you talked about cave paintings, one thing, and I'm going to retouch on something that you talked about after that. Um, Actually, cave paintings, one of the first cave paintings that I've researched or seen was in a Buddhist mural that was done with oil painting in Afghanistan in 650 AD. And this comes way before the Renaissance. And do you have in mind any other cave paintings that was around this time? Or was there like any significance to it? Because this one specifically, it, it resonates with me a lot. One thing, because it comes from my birthplace, and secondly, the usage of oil painting and also using actually lapis as a color-based painting that can was also used like in, let's say, all the way throughout Silk Road and even in Egypt.
Um, yeah, I know that within the area of South Asia, there are the Andaman and Nicobar Islands that have a lot of these caves that you can still visit today, which have remnants of paintings. There are also, I have a friend that works in Saudi Arabia, and she really likes kind of paintings or drawings rather left behind on rocks that are incredibly old, and I would want to say well before 650 AD. But there are so many instances of that. I know that there are not cave paintings exactly, but like carved seals that come from the Indus Valley civilization. And even though they're not the same style of art, I think they still are a testament to the same type of creativity that we're talking about. I think especially in regards to East to West, it's something that unifies culture, if that makes sense.
It does, absolutely. One other thing that raised something in my mind while you were talking about art, and you said about how you don't want to restrict it to just South Asian and Islamic art. I wanted to raise a point that to what level or to what degree can we or should we be proud of a certain art that comes from within a place we're born at, which again, uh, I want to argue that birth is an alternative, randomized factor that you're just born in one place and now you have parents and or you might not and you have art and everything else around you that you could identify with. To what level could we be proud of this and to what level can we have it as like an open thing for others to understand and know about more as well?
I think I wouldn't put a cap to how proud you can feel as long as, it comes from a place of curiosity and appreciation. It's also very difficult for me to say, well, I really like the histories and heritage of South Asia because I'm Indian by descent. I wasn't born in India. I was born in Kuwait. I've lived the majority of my life in the UAE. I've been integrated into the heritage and culture that comes from, my parents and the place I've grown up in. But also, my mother's family history is that of, her family were originally from Basra in Iraq, and then they immigrated, and then they found themselves in India. So I have somewhat of a connection. And then when I really got involved in art history and museums, I spent a very long time working in a heritage museum in Dubai. And I fell in love with the kind of stories that were there. And I feel proud of all of it, even though with some aspects of that, I don't have a really intimate connection by way of birth or nationality or descent. But I just really am curious about it. I love discovering things. And I think for anyone that wants to learn about cultures and heritage and traditions, if that is your starting point, I really don't think there is or there should be a kind of limit to how you can, or how much you can be proud of something and want to discover it more, and then moving on, want to share it. I think there's a kind of Eurocentric way of learning about art history and traditions and heritage, um, that is really defined and put into boxes. But I think if you allow yourself to be a lot more open, you see that we as people now, but also hundreds and hundreds of years ago, were constantly in conversation. So there are so many links that you can find, which makes it really difficult to say, well, this is where this started, and these are the people that own, this style of art or this way of working, because it's like, well, they do it more, but actually they found it on their travels, when they were in the Middle East, and then they came here. I think it's really difficult when you get to the root of it to be able to draw a linear timeline, because it's all jumbled up. And I think it's really enjoyable to see it as a jumbled mess, because then there's more to discover.
Exactly. Like the reason I pointed this out is because sometimes we can have this idea of claiming a certain art for ourselves and then fighting over it and saying, oh no, it came from here, and oh no, it came from here. But it's beautiful that you said that why not have an open mind and still have like a shared idea of, okay, it came from there, but maybe when I moved there, it became this. And one of the things that is controversial like this is biryani, which is a very delicious food. Um, I've researched a bit throughout my life because I just love biryani. Um, well, talking more into the etymology of biryani, it can be said that in different ways it originated in ancient Persia, which could be Iran, and then it went and traveled along to Afghanistan, and it kind of mixed up with a little more spices than rather than just saffron. And then they started adding meat along the way, and then it went further on to India and the Indian subcontinent and became what is now biryani. In a way, if we really think about it, we can see and appreciate how the movement of this by people shaped to what it became. And rather than like claiming, oh, it's mine or it's mine, it's mine, why not just say it's ours and like appreciate it more?
But yeah, sorry, I was just gonna say that, like, I think it's really interesting to classify food as art, because when you think of art, like traditionally, you think like paintings or pictures or like things like this, you know? You don't really think of like food as art. But really, if you kind of redefine that and go like art is something that like invites your senses or makes, like you can even go a step further and be like, okay, well, what are the senses? There's also smell. What about like perfume? And you have like Arabian oud and you have this, that, and the other. So it's really interesting to be able to broaden the definition of art like that. It's really pretty.
Yeah, I think it really comes down to how you would define art. And I think people would think of paintings and sculptures and what we would call fine art. But realistically, I think if you look at art as just a form of expression, when you're cooking and when you're making perfumes, when you are making textiles and designing clothes, all of that is a form of expression. And by extension, all of it is art. Um, I think perfumes and the culinary arts are really, really interesting because they are so closely linked. From my background working in that heritage museum, we had two pavilions within this really big site, which were the perfume house, and the other one was, a house related to food. And when you look at them individually, they obviously talk about things like oud and amber and perfumes and the kind of ingredients used. But then when you hear about it again in a different context, it's the same. It's ingredients, there's fermentation, there's lots of mixing and cooking happening. So I think all of it is art. And I think it also goes to show how necessary art in every form or shape of the word is important to us. Like we will, as humans, I think we will always go back to wanting to express it in one way or the other. And I think it's a beautiful thing to let people just do what they want and be creative. I also want to say about the whole biryani argument that you brought up, Imran. It is so great because if you look at biryani in its essence, it's rice and meat, and that's it. And obviously, it's more obvious when you are in South Asia or the Arab world. So you have biryani, you have mandi and majboos, and all of these dishes. But my partner is Spanish, and if you look at paella, it's basically rice and meat, and I'm like, we do the same things. That's what we as humans do. Like we got rice and we were eating meat, and we decided, hey, let's cook them together, and everyone does this. So I I would agree. It's a better thing to say we all have bits and variations of this that come from where we live in the world or what's available to us, and this is what we did. Let's share and talk about it and see how we can contribute to each other's attempts and make it better as a whole.
You talked about the idea of art being shared and how it can be something for everyone. I wanted to ask you, Jazz, to what level does Western art agrees with this, or to what level does it align with Western art and mainly European art, you could say?
Sorry, could you repeat the question?
Yeah, of course. Um, there's this idea of art being for everyone, and then
Mm,
it could also be
okay.
art being for a certain category, or not out of something, maybe something done on purpose, but maybe just because of the time it was created, it just became
Mhm.
something like that. How would you describe Western art in relation to this?
I mean, it's really interesting actually looking at the Western influence on fine art. I mean, if you look kind of historically, fine art was for the kind of what's the word? Sorry, what's the word I'm looking for? Like
Bourgeoisie,
yeah,
nobility,
yeah. Yeah, something
rich
like that.
people.
So for the rich people, essentially, I was looking for like a cool word for this. But yeah, for the rich people. And it's also very interesting how, the church held most of the money at the time. So all of these commissions and big art pieces that you see in like Christian or like Western art, because Western art was very much influenced by Christianity. So a lot of the commissioned pieces were kind of the biblical messages, but in images, because a lot of the general population didn't read, right? So, in order to influence or to teach, um, a lot of the biblical text was turned into images. Like you see this in like the Roman imagery, the catacomb frescoes, icons, mosaics, stained glass, like these were the Bible for people that couldn't read. And then you also have like Gothic cathedrals, which is literally like sermons in stone. Everything was very narrative, everything was very symbolic, everything was very dramatic. And then by the Renaissance, like things shifted again. So you have artists like Michelangelo and Leonardo who bring in realism, anatomy, and perspective. Because if God becomes man, then the human body itself becomes sacred. So that's why you see this like very I don't want to say obsessive, but almost obsessive attention to like human beauty and like humanized art. And even like in contemporary art, like this idea of like fine art being very like human based. And it's also very interesting to like contrast that with like Eastern traditions, where you compare it like in the Christian West versus like I would say, I don't know, like the Middle East kind of where it's all about like harmony and contemplation and like meditative like mosaics and what's the word for these?
Geometry?
Geometry, exactly. So it's all about like kind of expressing the cosmic order without like actual physical things. So that's interesting how the art there is contrasting.
Mhm. Yeah, that's really interesting because um in the South Asian art style, you have a lot of comparable to Western European Christian depictions of, you know, the saints and the Virgin and the angels, and that exists in South Asian temples, bas reliefs that you would have, architecture, and it also comes from a place of wanting to express religious symbolism, and those are really, really. I think if you look at temple idols in South Asia, they're really, really obvious to see because there's so many depictions of the various avatars of the various gods, but also all the apsaras, which are the angels or the muses, kind of equivalent. And there's a lot of depiction of the divine that is very, very similar to Western Christian art. But when you look at it in from the Islamic perspective, because for religious reasons you're not allowed to depict faces and personifications, there is still the urge and the desire to represent divinity and that kind of meditation that you talked about, but that it transforms within the Islamic perspective to geometric shapes and calligraphy, which has had its own kind of development through the ages. Like Arabic is beautiful when you trace it through the various scripts that were developed, particularly from the need to be able to put them on buildings. The thing that I really like and I find fascinating is the Kufic script, which is really like block letters, like Times New Roman, but for Arabic. And it obviously has, you know, its history in calligraphy, but there was also the fact that because of this particular type of script, it was easy to put scripture on mosque walls because the letters are really block and they can be connected. And there's an element of it being obviously beautiful and aesthetically appealing as calligraphy is, but it also has a practical purpose that it serves, which, you know, develops in all the cultures that you see based on, well, this is what we need at the moment. And that's how art also develops. And that I think carries on to whether we're talking about the fine arts, so painting and sculpture, but also when we're talking about the culinary arts and textiles. And I think it's really fascinating because you get to see this kind of convergence of human creativity, not just in terms of wanting to express things, but also human creativity in just being practical and, you know, being resourceful, which is really evident to see in these cultures.
Something that again, there's going to be a lot of stuff during this podcast that's going to come on my mind. I'm going to reflect it back to you guys. One thing, you talked about the geometrical patterns, especially in Islamic art. One piece of architecture that really resonates with me, maybe because I was just around it a lot, maybe I could just connect with it a lot, was the shapes and the muqarnas in itself, like the dome shape architecture that could be found in uh, places of worship, or it could just be in ancient mosques that are not necessarily mosques anymore, but it could just be museums now. What is the significance of muqarnas and the shapes inside it? Because when I look at it, sometimes it's almost like a honeycomb combination when you mix a lot of the geometrical patterns inside it. And I've researched a bit about honeycomb shapes, and it seems to be one of the strongest shapes when it's applied to a certain architecture piece. What would you say is the other significance of muqarnas in itself?
I cannot cite off the top of my head right now, but I remember reading about this. And I believe it has a little bit to do also with acoustics, because obviously in places of worship, particularly Islamic places of worship, you would have the call to prayer. And I think there's an element of when you read scripture and when you read the Quran inside, Obviously we didn't have microphones many years ago, or speakers, so the sound would carry, and the sound would echo is the wrong word, but it would be amplified, sorry, and it would be jumping off the walls. And I think the fact that it is dome shaped and it has those honeycomb structures helps with that. And I think there's also the obvious, it's a more secure, stable structure in terms of infrastructure. Yeah. Yeah. I'm sure there is an element of the kind of repetitive design coming from, what you talked about before, Jazz, which is the meditative way of looking at repetition and geometry. And there's also a lot to be said about, in the Islamic golden age that we talk about, there was a lot of research into mathematics and geometry and the sciences in general. And I want to say that that is almost like a precursor to all of that, and a kind of expansion into that kind of design, because a lot of those sculptures that you see, especially the geometric shapes, I know there's a lot of mathematical formulation that I cannot do because I do not understand numbers. But you can understand that, and you can tell that the people that made these and designed these had all of this going on in the back of their head. And they were clearly people that really were passionate about their craft to be able to think of all that.
I think it's really interesting that we've kind of explored the religious side of, or like the religious influence on art. But like also what's popping into my mind right now is the kind of more spiritual art rather than like a depiction of divine, like I'm thinking more like East Asian art of like, it's kind of made on scrolls, and it's a lot of like scenery and mountains and things like this. Like, do you have any kind of ideas around that?
I think, I mean, there's one side which is, at the time, I think for both, particularly for Western Christian art, but also for, the South Asian and East Asian counterparts, the type of art you could make depended really severely on who was paying for it. And at the time, it was a lot of religious places that had the money, and therefore they were the biggest patrons. And if you want to keep a patron happy, you're going to make the stuff that they want. So there is that side of why a lot of art has divine expressions and divine symbolism. But I also think at a time where, if you look at it from a spiritual point of view, you are going to find beauty, and therefore divinity in things that are really aesthetically appealing. And I think landscape particularly has a lot to do with that. And if you extend that to the Islamic part, if your religion has a say in saying, well, we don't really paint faces or people because of certain restrictions, I think you will naturally turn to landscapes and finding the divine and finding spirituality in what the world looks like. I think also, I mean, there's an element of, well, if you're painting portraiture, you have to have a model, and I don't know how easy they'd be available, but you can realistically just take your kit and go out and paint the wall, because it's free, because you don't have to pay anyone and it's right there. And anyone can do it, especially if you're someone that needs a lot of practice and you are, an artist that's still refining their craft. Landscape is great to paint because you can just walk out and do the same thing over and over and find repetition. So I want to say that's why. But I think through the process of it, you would also find a kind of spiritual release. And going back to like geometric shapes and that kind of repetitive process, they are known to be really therapeutic. I mean, I have friends who still like make mandalas because they really like that kind of geometric patterns, that it looks really aesthetically appealing. And it has been and still is a form of meditation for, the Buddhist monks. where they make the same patterns again and again. And it's also really interesting because just looking at it from a modern time period and looking at, how we understand art and how it plays a role in everyday life for regular people. In India, there's a festival called Diwali, where you make rangolis, which are geometric patterns made with, powdered color, that people every day make outside. Everyday people, make it outside their homes as a kind of decoration for the house. I'm sure there are religious connotations to it, but it's something that brings me back to like what I started with as art. That's something you share with everyone, because making rangolis is something you do with your family. When you live around them, I remember, getting together with friends, and we would go to my aunt's house, and we would all, a few days up to the celebrations, we would have like with our pen and paper, and my uncle would, because he's an engineer, he would get out all the mathematics of it. He'd be like, this is how many pieces we need, this is this. Like, we would all come together and do this process that is a geometric shape, that's repetitive, and that celebration of a religious festival. But there's a certain spirituality that you find, even if you're not religious, you're getting together with people, and it's just something you all do together, and you're engaging with art and culture and tradition and heritage. So I think people don't realize how closely integrated art and culture and heritage are in their everyday lives until you nitpick at everything, and then you realize, oh, I do this all the time. It's such a big part of my life. Sorry, I've gone on a bit about that.
No, we
No,
love
but
it.
it's great because you've actually raised a very important point, and it's kind of like how it shapes cultures. It does actively shape cultures, and in that it shapes your individual cultural identity and how you want to show up in that culture as well. Like, kind of going back to what I was saying earlier about the Western art and how it's very humanized. Like, if we were to look at the impact of that in your own kind of cultural identity, you see that in like Western cultures, it's very like individualistic. It's very about like your story, your personal journey, your voice matters, and it's like how you show up in the culture is very important. Your uniqueness, who you are as a person, whether that's in like your clothing style or whether that's in your views. You're always kind of invited to be yourself. You're expected to speak up, you're expected to stand out, like show who you are. Whereas in the East, it's kind of more about like balance and symbolism and cycles. Like there's no this individual realism. The emphasis is on harmony. And that is also like community, like community harmony. There's like hierarchies that you need to respect. There's ways that you need to show up. There's ways that you need to speak. And it's also very interesting to see like how that is, or like how that plays when an Easterner goes into like a Western kind of culture, or like vice versa. Yeah, like I feel like an Easterner going into Western culture might feel a kind of pressure to stand out and be like, okay, why do I have to? We're kind of used to this harmony and this community, and we're all kind of together, and we like help each other. Whereas a Westerner going into an Eastern culture, or a very more traditional Eastern culture, might feel a bit stifled. What do you think about this?
Yeah, I think there's that kind of culture shock that happens. I think it also exists the other way around, where so in the South Asian Islamic context, we're all, like you said, that there is a balance. We are all one people, yet within that there is a kind of built hierarchy, and I think that's really well explained in the kind of language that exists. So I know that in most South Asian, East Asian, even Islamic languages, there are really specific terms for every single relationship that you have, which is great because I know when my mother introduces me to like some family member that I have no idea who they are, the word that she uses in front of their name, I know exactly what their relation is to my mother, what their relationship is to the family at whole, what I'm supposed to refer to them as. It's really straightforward, and there is that kind of respect that exists within this hierarchy. And to compare that with the Western side of it, which I find a little difficult, is everyone is an uncle and everyone is an aunt and everyone is a cousin, and it's not a weird thing. It's that's just a part of life. You don't have any of that. And yeah, there are these unwritten rules that exist within the kind of South Asian kind of culture that make a lot of sense and can be really daunting to someone that comes from outside of this. But at the same time, I think there are also, I don't think either system is perfect. I think there's,
It makes a lot
Yeah,
of sense to you, you know, because you've
yeah,
grown up in it, and also me as an Arab, you know, it
exactly.
makes a lot of sense to me. I know exactly how I need to act when this person is in front of me. I know I can't
Yeah,
speak like this, or you know. But if a Westerner was to come and look at this, they might go, "Well, hold on, like what's going on here?" You know, they don't really understand your.
absolutely.
yeah, and also honorifics built into languages. So I know a lot of East Asian language like Korean, Japanese there, and Hindi and Urdu. There's, you know, even the verbs you use, there's a certain way to conjugate them when you're speaking to someone that's older to you, someone in a formal capacity. The language changes. And like I said, my partner is Spanish, and he's like, when I met his parents, they're like, "No, call us by our names." I said, "You do not understand how much I cannot do that. It feels wrong." Like this is something that would never happen in like where I come from. It just feels so wrong to me. But it's been a learning curve. And I think it's a great example of how there are, like with lots of other things, there are bits and pieces of cultures all across the globe, that are really good, and some that we can, you know, try to let go of and try to like get rid of slowly. And being in a place where you can share the good bits of each other's cultures is, it is a privilege where you can collectively decide to say, so these are the things that we've evolved and these are the things we've developed. They clearly work. They're a great thing. Why don't we share this and kind of make our own, almost like a neo-Dadaist group where nothing makes sense, but it works for all of us, and let's try and develop that more. But it is absolutely a culture shock in the beginning, and it can be really, really funny to see.
Yeah, but people can definitely struggle, whether it's in like, you know,
Yeah,
family context or even in like work context, you know, like a Westerner might come across as confrontational. Whereas like, for example, an Eastern student may struggle in a Western classroom because like self-promotion and speaking up count towards participation. So they might feel like, oh, like
yeah.
they're outspoken, you know, like
Hmm.
it's very interesting how art directly impacts that, and you don't think about that very often.
Yeah, that is absolutely true. And that is really prominent in not just the fine arts, but even, um I'm not the most knowledgeable in music, but there is a sense of, you know, South Asian music that is kind of dependent on harmony and collective harmony, and you don't have one or two instruments that immediately stand out. It is a collective thing, which is also the way we talk about families working and how we talk about, you know, when families talk about cooking, um, and holding an event. It's always about, you know, we are only as strong when we are together, and individualism is going to put a crack in our really well structured thing. And there's the good side of it, which is you learn to work really well in a team. You learn to be really considerate of others, and be aware of how you're contributing and how you can kind of step in, pick up the slack when someone else isn't able to. Like those are really good practical real life skills that you learn. But on the downside, there's very little space for individualism. It's really difficult for, I think, people that grow up in these cultures to be comfortable with saying, well, I did this, this is my contribution. It's always a we and it's always a collective. And yet you can, I think, if you do enough research, like trace a direct line to how this has evolved from the culture and the art and the way we look at the world within these cultures.
You guys have raised very good notions. One thing that, so coming from Afghanistan to the UK, it's and specifically in different ways of expressing myself or having the idea of community versus individualism. I struggled a lot at the beginning and even throughout now to, in different ways, if let's say I want to express myself or if I want to talk more about myself, I tend not to, and sometimes, and it feels almost as if like, oh, like it's too much. Am I doing the right thing? Am I doing it the right way? Or am I not giving enough space for the others? And it came, I think a lot of other people that have the same kind of experiences would say something along the same line, that coming from an Eastern culture where it's all about community and giving back to others and receiving back, and then coming here and wanting to express yourself and giving back and or giving even and
And
not
having to
receiving
be very
minimum.
self-sufficient also.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
It doesn't really, it takes time and it takes practice in order to get this idea or even encrypt this idea in your mind that it's okay to resonate, or it's okay to still express yourself and say what you're proud of as you, and then still have the idea of community. I think it's something that art is how it shapes all of this, and it does come with a journey while you travel or while you immigrate, and it comes with cultural shock again. One thing I wanted to point out is in Afghanistan mainly, when you have a lot of people, like let's say in a group setting, which can be a lot of times, um, there will be people talking, and people again have to speak in a certain manner. You can't really talk back to your elders, and or you can't really, let's say, have a radical idea that would go against the uh, agenda of the group or like something that they believe in. One thing that comes with this is even though there will be different hierarchies of people that speak with each other, there's still a lot of interrupting each other or jumping in to talk about something while they're debating or whether or not. It's something that I've realized coming here, and it's something that I still notice every now and then. Sometimes I'm with my friends or I'm with just people that I work with outside, and they're speaking, and then I jump in and interrupt. Sometimes it almost feels like I'm interrupting them, but again, it's kind of how I was brought up and kind of the way I see um, group discussions. Like somebody's talking, and in a way, I jump in to add in something. And I think many other cultures have similar stuff.
I mean, one of the most powerful parts of cultural intelligence is self-awareness and understanding, your own way of thinking is not universal, it's inherited. If you grew up in the West, you might suddenly realize I value self-expression because my culture taught me that beauty is individual. And if you grew up in the East, you might realize I value harmony because my culture taught me that beauty is balance. So kind of coming back to the title of the podcast, it's art becomes a mirror. And that awareness makes you a better listener, a better leader, and a better traveler because you're operating consciously rather than like on autopilot, right?
Yeah.
I think this. Sorry. No, it's okay. I was just gonna like put in like a tiny thing which I got reminded of based literally what you just said, which is like I want to say a really old interview that I saw of Ethan Hawke where he talks about poetry, but it really applies to all sorts of art, which is you don't think, and I'm paraphrasing, but it's that you don't really realize that you don't like poetry and then something big happens in your life, like either someone passes away, you have a breakup, but something big happens and you turn to poetry is what he said, but I've turned to art, and that can be art from any culture, and then there's immediately a connection of someone else felt this way so many years ago, and that's reflected in how I feel. Someone you don't know from a culture, from a country that you have no idea, you may never have been to, but somehow they were feeling the same things, and you can see it in what they've created, and immediately you're connected. And I think that's something really powerful that exists with art. And I think that's the good bit of being part of, any culture, is that it allows you to have a connection with anyone else, if you can search for it. Hopefully, it doesn't come in your life when something bad happens, but it exists.
Yeah.
Guys, we did have questions that we asked our audience on our Instagram. Also, make sure to follow us on East to West on Instagram. We will share the link in the descriptions below. But we did have some questions that we wanted to ask our dear guest, Shaima Bohari, and I think Jazz has those questions.
So the first topic that comes up in the questions is around art and identity. And the first question, well, people kind of, it was a 50-50 vote on this particular poll. But I guess we'll go with, I guess the choice is up to me, guys. Does globalization dilute or strengthen cultural authenticity in art?
I think it really depends on how you look at it, because you can look at it as, this is a ridiculous comparison, but I recently learned a very interesting fact, which is true of Christianity, where if you have a little part of holy water, you cannot dilute holy water, right? If you add like a teaspoon into a liter, the liter becomes holy water now. And I like to think about authenticity in terms of culture, and especially in this kind of world that we live in that's really a lot more connected like that. Like, there is no chance of you going somewhere else and completely losing yourself, because people have a really strong identity, even if they don't think they do. You have experiences that have been a part of you, and when you are put in a completely different space, in a completely different situation, I think by default, you will contribute and you will add your own bits, and everyone will become changed. I like to think for the better, but it's not one person becoming diluted or the other group becoming stronger. It's everyone as a group is just going to learn so much more. They're going to be exposed to better things, and we will all become better, which is probably my really optimistic point of view on the world.
That's an insanely pretty comparison that you made there. I love that.
I like to think that. Yeah, I think it's really difficult to say. I think it obviously does come from what individual intention is, but as far as culture goes, I think it's really difficult to be exposed to different people and different ways of thinking, and not have changed for the better, even if it's in a tiny capacity.
Mm. Okay, we'll move on to the next topic, which is power and influence. The question that has been the highest, well, that has had the highest votes is, has art always served power? And we've talked about this a little bit, but
Yeah. We absolutely, we talked about this, especially when you talked about the relationship Western art had with the church, and there was a similarity, particularly in South Asia, in the Indian context, about religion being on, and at the time, religious scripture and the temples and the knowledge being only available to people that were in the highest caste, which were the Brahmins. So there is kind of a parallel, and if you look at it in that terms, absolutely, art has always served power, but I think that definition of power has changed as we have, gone through life. And I know in the European world, in the Western world, there's a very clear timeline that you can look at where, especially in like the French academy context, you see that those are no longer the people that hold power, and the artists have kind of taken some of that back for themselves, and that's where the power lies. So yeah, I think art will always serve power. It will just depend on who has the power, and who holds it and where that's situated.
Yeah. Also, like, just kind of what came up in my mind is like satirical art, which is
Yeah.
interesting. It's kind of like against power, which is just a thought that I had while you were speaking. Um,
Yeah.
okay, topic three is East meets West. Sorry, let me repeat that. Topic three is East meets West. That is a tongue twister. The highest voted option is Can art bridge civilizations? And I think biryani was like a nice little thing that we had going there. But do you have any other?
Uh, yeah, like I have seen so many performances of like fusion dance forms. I think the one that comes to mind immediately was a duo performance between, I think, a Bharatanatyam dancer and a flamenco dancer. They were playing off the same rhythm, the same beats, and yeah, I think there are absolutely bridges to be made everywhere, whether that's in food, whether that's in performative arts, whether that is, in anything, even the fine arts. I mean, there's I worked on an article which was about the history of the color blue, and it was talking about pigments. And one of the things I talked about was how certain pigments moved through cultures and moved through countries. And, you have a big history of blue ceramics that, initially came from, started in China, but made their way to the European part of the world through trade. And you have so many examples in the UK of pieces of furniture that have mother of pearl and tortoiseshell and enamel, which are techniques that, started in a different part of the world. But people, I mean, there's questionable history about, how these objects came here, but there is something to be said about an appreciation of art styles and art forms that were foreign, but people saw the value and the beauty that existed. So yeah, I think absolutely. I mean, the three of us are from three very different parts of the world, and we are having this conversation in London, so that says something about making bridges.
One thing that just spurred to my mind was you talked about having shared art, and you spoke about dance. There's one specific dance in Afghanistan called atan, which is there's different ways of dancing atan, but generally they dance in a circle. um, and it can be debated that it originated all the way back from Zoroastrian times. And I've seen similarities of this in the Gujarati dance called Garba or Gabra. If I'm correct me if I'm
Yeah,
wrong.
Garba.
Garba, yes. I've seen it dance very similarly, and the way
Mhm.
they go around the circle and the way they clap their hands and go back and then they come back to it. And there's even different variations to it. There's ones that even in Afghanistan you see like do this dance with swords or sometimes even with sticks. I've seen this beautiful common shared art. Some might not see it that way, but I mean, that goes back to their own point of view. Maybe they need to widen their horizons. But I see it as a common identity that we could all, in a way, connect with rather than separate ourselves from each other. And even talking more about this dance, Atan, inside Afghanistan and even in Pakistan, there's different variations. If you go, like, let's say in the center of Afghanistan, there's maybe they would do like 3 turns and then go back to the basic and then go back again, and then collect it back at the end. And if you go like a little southern region, they might do like very quick turns, and then they might have like another variation. So in a way, it goes back to how art can be shaped based on where it is and based on the time it is.
The UAE has a really rich pearling history. And so there's a lot of history about pearl divers, and they would go out onto the water, and they would, dive for pearls. Side note. But the reason I bring that up is because there was a big craze about sea shanties, and that is something that happens in the UAE. So there's a very rich history of these pearl divers that would be on the boats, and they would sing songs while they were shucking oysters, they were pulling the ropes, they were, taking the sails up, which has the same pattern of European sea shanties. So if you look at Ireland and Scotland, and that has nothing to do with communications or trade, but that's because it's based in the same principle that if you're doing boring work and if you have a song that's repetitive, it makes it easier, and that's why we have sea shanties. And I love that fact, because that is something that I would use to, get people interested in different cultures, and to say, if you take 2 completely different groups of humans and give them the same problem, most times they will come up with a very similar solution, which just goes to show how connected we are despite our cultural differences and, how we've grown up. We all think the same.
Wow, that's a really pretty
Random little
example
fact.
of how art can bridge civilizations. That's very pretty. Our 4th topic is meaning and beauty. We have again a 50-50 vote on this one, but I do feel like we've kind of covered these topics, and I am a bit aware of the time. I will just read out the questions in case you guys have any kind of pointers, but if not, then I'll just move on to the next ones. So the first option is what makes art beautiful across cultures, and the other option is how do harmony and emotion differ east to west? What do you guys think?
I think the harmony question we have talked about, I think, at length, because we did talk about collectiveness. I think what makes art beautiful is really related to that, because it's dependent in culture. And as much of a cliche answer as this is, it, like, beauty is very like subjective to who is looking at it. And I think the good thing about us as people is our definition of what we find beautiful changes, which is a really good thing, because that means we have the space to evolve. Yeah.
I
Yeah.
also feel like there's a certain timing with how we see art, and a certain timing with if it's the right time for a certain art. I personally, well, my background comes a lot from resistance, and mainly connecting with the ideas of art in resistance, which is something I'm going to talk about a little bit. But art in itself, I feel like timing has a significant importance to how you see it. Like right now, there's a certain type of art that I would understand a lot more, especially like, let's say, Islamic art. Growing up as a kid, I didn't really see it the way I used to see it. I would just, as let's say a 5-year-old kid, when I would go to the mosque with my dad, like I would see a blue mosque, and I would just be like, it's like my first time seeing it, and I'm just seeing the blue patterns, and I'm seeing the geometrical patterns. I would kind of connect with it, but wouldn't really understand why I connect with it, or I wouldn't really know the meaning of it. But looking back at it now, it can be a whole other perspective and viewpoint to it for sure.
Yeah, but 100%, I agree. The final topic, guys, is modern relevance. Um, let's go with, what does AI art mean for cultural identity? And I think this is a very new kind of issue that does impact art, you know? So I thought it would be quite relevant to have that as our kind of closing question.
Um, I'm gonna go on a rant about how I don't like AI in a minute. But I think there are some benefits. I'm stretching myself here, but if you want to learn and if you want to find information and, maybe get an insight to how to start, I guess you could, have AI help out with giving you that information of where you start. But something that is consistent across cultures, whether that's the Western point, South Asian, Islamic art, is a really important part of creating art is the process you go through. And that requires you being really bad at it in the beginning. And then you slowly, get better and better at what you do. And I think AI kind of takes away from that process, because when you go through if you are someone, so I picked up crocheting, and I'm not great at it, but I went through a lot of days of getting stuck and really struggling and being frustrated. And then I got to a point where I was able to make things that looked kind of like the things they were supposed to. But that process was what I found comfort in. It was that repetitive motion that we talked about, which says a lot about my ADHD. And I think a lot of things that in the past were undiagnosed, but there's something to be said about more value placed in how you go about learning things and getting better, as opposed to art that is created virtually. And I think as much as you can train an algorithm to come out with stuff, it'll always be inspired by something that it has in its database, which I think distinguishes to some extent people, because you will have a people will have a better definition of saying, well, this is individual creativity. It may still be inspired, but in a different, I guess, more ethical way. But that's just my take on AI.
Yeah, but AI is basically taking from human works in order to create, new things. You even the prompts that you write, you might say like, I want it to look like this or that and the other. And the way AI knows that is through, human work. But it's going to be an interesting age, guys. It's going to be a very interesting next couple of decades.
Yeah.
Let's see how that goes.
When you pointed this question out, my mind went straight to the creator of Studio Gilby, Miyazaki. Yeah, Miyazaki specifically. I've seen an interview of him with his new employees, and they're like pitching the idea of, oh, how about we have AI do some of our new arts? And he kind of just looks at them in disgust, and he's like, I'd rather not. But it definitely is something that has been taking over and something that will be taken over. But for sure, I don't feel like it will take the individuality and the essence of the artist in itself. But we've already seen it shaping the art around us and becoming a thing of its own. Like for example, there's a lot of places that are using models, AI models now, instead of actually having to pay models. They just go and pay like a very minimum amount to a AI website, and they have a model with their clothes on that they want to, let's say, portray. But this can be, it definitely is something to come. But I still feel like the core individuality of art and the what it speaks will remain the same. I hope, at least, to a good
Yeah, I
degree.
guess it's like kind of what Shema was saying earlier about like it being about the process, you know, the process
Yeah,
is the beautiful thing about it. And
yeah,
there is no
Yeah.
process, you're just typing really when AI comes out with things. And if you see kind of like the more influential pieces of art, you hear about the artist's story and like what they went through. Like think of like Van Gogh, you know, like what he went through. And that's why his art is so like influential, right? Not influential, that's not the word. Relevant, I guess.
Yeah.
But the words are escaping me, and I think that brings
Yeah.
us to the end of our very first podcast, very first episode of Voices from East to West. If you guys made it this far, thank you so much. Seriously, launching this podcast has been a long time coming, and having you here means everything. Today, we explored how art doesn't just sit on museum walls or live in textbooks, it lives in us. It shapes the way that we see ourselves and sometimes reveals part of identity that we didn't parts of our identity that we didn't have the words for. And with guests like Shema, who brings history, education, and the lived experience into the room, these conversations become so much richer. If this episode made you guys think differently about the role of art or made you curious about your own cultural story, then we've done our job. And this is only the beginning. Every episode, we're going to dive deeper into the things that make us who we are, our cultures, our values, our biases, our identities, and how understanding all of this makes us better global citizens and stronger leaders. Make sure to follow and subscribe and share it with someone who'd love this conversation and connect with us on our East to West platforms. We'd love to hear what resonated with you and what you want to unpack next. Shema, thank you so much for your time today. We really, really appreciate you being here. You've really brought
thank you,
this like
Shaima.
amazing points of view that, you know, I never would have thought of. So I really appreciate your time. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me. This was great. You should definitely do more.
Anyways, guys, until next time, I'm Jaz, and this is Emran, and we'll see you in the next episodes of Voices from East to West.